Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon. I'm the CEO and co-founder with Impetus Digital. Impetus Digital has built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools. We've worked with pharma companies, life science companies from across the globe over the last 13 years to help them build out virtual advisory boards, steering committees, investigator groups, medical education. And with the recent launch of our Insight Events platform, we've been helping companies with hackathons, internal corporate meetings, sales training, and all kinds of other fun things. But more importantly, at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations with some of the leading edge thinkers, leading edge technology, entrepreneurs, we can all work together to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. And we can't just start with the conversation, we need to sustain them. This is precisely the reason we have built the series of asynchronous and synchronous touch points through our platform, so we can continue these discussions. We can build momentum, we can push the agenda forward on new policies, new legislation, new ideas, and we can all create the serendipity of random collisions. So I'm really thrilled to have somebody at the table today with me, and this is actually Tom Lawry. He actually serves as the National Director of Artificial Intelligence for Health and Life Sciences at Microsoft. And we've been hearing a lot about Microsoft lately, and they've been doing an amazing job and delving really deeply in the healthcare space. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have Tom with me today. He previously served as the Director of Worldwide Health. And in his current role, Tom works with providers, payers, all sorts of life science organizations, basically planning and implementing all sorts of innovative analytical solutions that are going to help with the quality and efficiency of health services delivered really literally across the globe. So Tom focuses on strategies for digital transformation, which is applied to performance optimization. This includes artificial intelligence, machine learning, as well as all kinds of cognitive services. Prior to Microsoft, Tom served as a senior director at GE Healthcare with global responsibilities for revenue cycle management analytics and operational performance solutions. He was also the founder and the CEO of a company called Veris. This was a healthcare software company, and it has served in he's also served in various executive management roles in hospitals and integrated delivery networks. He also has published numerous articles, as well as a fantastic book called AI in Health. We're going to be discussing, where he's actually discussing the use of technology to innovate healthcare. So an incredible background. So happy to have you, Tom. Thanks for being on the show.
Well, Natalie, thanks for having me. I think you left out the paper route I had when I was 14, but thank you for running down that list of all the things I've done, or as my mom used to say, I just can't keep a job.
I just want to say what an incredible background, and so many great things that have happened. GE Health, being at Microsoft, and being the leader and the CEO of a startup, Veris. You've learned all kinds of things. How did you land in the place that you are today?
Well, it's a long journey, as you just outlined. So, more than anything, I've always been one of those people that from a skill basis, I was never the best at anything. But the one thing that I guess has always driven me forward is I've got this perpetual curiosity. So you look at things like artificial intelligence, and back when I did my first startup, it was all around essentially hosted software. We hadn't invented the term cloud yet, but a lot of it was just looking at the way things worked, being curious about things like artificial intelligence, or then the growing nature of this thing called the internet and web protocols, and looking at how you take these emerging technologies and use them to start solving problems that previously were either unsolvable or they were much harder to solve because you didn't have those technologies and those avenues available. So I've always been one of those people that's curious, and somehow I start looking at how to apply the technology to really innovate the way anything, particularly in health and medicine, works.
I absolutely love that, because I started off our conversation by saying everything starts with a conversation. But prior to that, you sort of hit that right on the head, which is really everything starts with a question. So I love the fact that you really have, have a flourishing career and all the things you've contributed really because you've had a curious mind. I'm
Yeah.
thrilled as well to, sorry, go ahead, please.
No, I was going to say, as you're talking about that, so, obviously I love data and numbers, but I'm also kind of a student of words. And to your point, one of the most interesting words in the English language anyway is the simple word of why, because, if I say why, many times the first thing one thinks is a question, which it is, but it's also a declaration of why we should do things. So I look at, problem solving, I look at the creative use of data and AI, and it's the, why should we do it? And we can talk for at least an hour about the challenges in healthcare and life sciences. And then it becomes the declarative, say there's so many opportunities to take what we care about in health and medicine and life science and make it better.
So what came first, the role at Microsoft or the book that you wrote called Artificial Intelligence in Healthcare, A Leader's Guide to Winning in the New Age of Intelligent Health Systems?
Well,
What
again,
preceded
yeah.
the other and why?
Well, first of all, thanks for the shout out on the book. Yeah. So there's a very large healthcare IT organization in the world called HIMSS. Um, and essentially, they are an association representing healthcare IT professionals. So they came to me, it was probably 2 years ago now. My book was published a year ago, this past March. But essentially, they came to me and said, look, we've got dozens of books on the technical side, the programming side of artificial intelligence. We really don't have anything when it comes to helping non-programmers, non-technical people who are clinical leaders, who are running hospitals or running divisions within pharma orgs to really understand what it is, but more importantly, how they need to understand not only what it is, but how to apply it to be better at whatever they did. So you're a product developer, you're a data scientist that already knows a lot about the programming side, but so much of driving value with artificial intelligence is less about the technology, less about the algorithm, and a lot more about understanding things like clinical and operational workflow, understanding that in order to do true things like predictive capabilities, you have to do a better job of creating what I call a modern data estate. So it was a book written about all those things that the technology is dependent on when it comes to driving value at scale.
Yeah, brilliant, and such a needed book. I, I think the first thing that comes to many people's mind is we've known Microsoft for eons. It's been one of those iconic companies. It's been around forever. It's always been one of those epic companies that has always done well. We've heard recently of some of the fantastic work that's been happening with teams and since COVID-19, this acceleration of growth. But we've always considered Microsoft more of like a company that did like, you know, PowerPoint and Excel and, those sorts of business operations. How do you get people's head around Microsoft getting into healthcare? What does that look
Yeah.
like?
Well, it's a great question. And so, backing up, there are a lot of things that when you look at the evolution of technology, we not only were part of it, but we drove a lot of those things through the last several decades. Probably the pivot point for Microsoft came with the true advent of the cloud and everyone moving in that direction for any of many reasons when it comes to true transformation, use of data. And then part of that was backed up by what, was Satya Nadella is no longer our new leader, but Satya coming in had a dramatic effect on shifting not only the strategy, but the culture of the organization. So then leading up to your question of healthcare, we serve many verticals and our primary focus as a company is to develop the best world-leading transformational technology that then gets applied across all segments. So banking, retail, finance, and healthcare. But increasingly, as we look ahead, there are certain verticals that are important to us and none more important than health and medicine. So within that, our approach is there are a few things that we are doing that would be considered first party. So for example, we just announced last month the intention to acquire a great company called Nuance. Nuance is leading the way when it comes to conversational AI in health and medicine. Much of that is based on some underlying technology Microsoft actually created at Microsoft Research. So we have certain instances like that. But the majority of time when it comes to our position in healthcare comes not from being first party, but by working with the best vendors of all those things you imagine that are used by providers and payers in life science. You know, organizations like the best electronic medical record providers, the best in imaging, the best in technology for managing clinical drug research. And what happens there is, you know, we help them become more intelligent. So going forward, the idea is if we were to walk through a hospital in a couple years and we were to say, let's pop the hood on what's happening with the electronic medical record, with the imaging systems, with registration, any of the intelligence that's really going through those systems when you look at what's underneath are really the Microsoft components of data, AI, the Microsoft Cloud for Health. So our job is to really take those who do the best at something, make them better by making those things more intelligent and increasingly more cloud driven.
I love how succinctly that you put that, and that is just brilliant. It's sort of like adding the technicolor, if you will, to the black and white picture. And I'm just curious as well, Tom, there's the world prior to COVID, and then there's the world afterwards. We've seen the surge and the groundswell of the tailwinds that have propelled so many tech stocks, tech companies. You know, we're kind of in a bit of a bumpy road, but that's besides the point. But there's just been an acceleration of digital adoption.
Mhm.
What did people's adoption of Microsoft Cloud for Healthcare look and feel in healthcare, in institutions, in physician offices? And what does it look like today? What is the proclivity for inviting it, for entertaining it, and being open to changing and adopting it?
Another great question. You know, I start by saying, and our CEO said it first, where you know he basically reflected on how while everyone talks about digital transformation, we saw years worth of digital transformation occur in a matter of months due to COVID. So, you know, relative to healthcare, we saw a lot of challenging things, but we learned a lot of lessons. The first lesson I would point out is that because of COVID, we demonstrated that healthcare is capable of agile transformation. I mean, many times healthcare and health and medicine is seen as moving at glacial speed when it comes to innovation. But again, heroic efforts by clinicians, doctors, nurses, healthcare executives. I mean, think about the tremendous speed where a year ago people thought it'd be impossible to have a vaccine, and here we are a year later, and it was done. So COVID drove a lot of things, including it proved agile transformation is possible. Two, it also showed that AI can produce great value and basically have a short time to value. So a quick example, a year ago when COVID was first really roaring into America and everyone was trying to get their hands around what to do, Microsoft already had a health grade bot that allowed us to do secure and compliant things with a bot. So we quickly converted that into a COVID bot or a coronavirus bot, made it publicly available. Groups like CDC and hospitals around the world adopted it. It was used by tens of millions of consumers to basically have an avenue to go out, walk through a triage of what they were experiencing and their family members experiencing, and then that would lead to recommendations on what to do. You're okay for now. Go to your provider immediately. So that one thing alone, when you think about consumers or think about tens of millions of people around the world having access to that whenever they wanted, you can only imagine if those were people, you know, calling into a phone bank that was staffed by humans, what would that have looked like? And chances are, you know, it wouldn't have ever happened. So it's one of many examples to say the technology in the hands of creative people who are trying to find ways of truly innovating. And particularly, you know, there's an old adage that a mentor of mine used to put out of when you feel the heat, you see the light. And we saw tremendous efforts by health and medical leaders to basically rework the way things were done to accommodate patients, to get care delivered. And it was mainly on writing on the technology that we and others provide.
You're hearing a lot about people wanting to go back to the new normal, and there's tons of reasons for that. And you're seeing things opening up and the demasking and all sorts of things. And there's also this discussion of, telemedicine might get put by the wayside. In real life is, an IRL is going to be the way moving forward. What is the prediction that Microsoft has about some of the inroads that you've already made on telemedicine, on some of the chatbots, some of the investments that you made with Nuance and sort of the new, I guess, talk technologies that are really going to make gigantic changes with how healthcare is going to be and conditions are going to be diagnosed and monitored?
Yeah, great question. So, at some level, what I'd say is, that genie is not going back in the bottle anytime soon. It's interesting because we are seeing a number of things happen. So when COVID hit and everyone swung around to telemedicine, it worked well. And you look at the stats of any provider organization last year, and they went from maybe piloting some things to thousands and thousands of virtual visits, and it worked. Um, there is a little bit of a how do we hold the gains question going on now. Some of it is legitimate. There are certain things that, for example, there are certain things that are ideal for a telemedicine visit. There are certain other things that really, having that face-to-face contact between a patient and a provider is truly critical to the quality and understanding what to do. Um, Beyond that, we're also seeing that COVID and telemedicine is starting to really open things up for thinking where, there's telemedicine, then there's more of the virtual visits, and then there is increasingly in the United States something called hospital at home, which is basically looking at what has previously been done in a hospital being done in the home. And so there's this continuum that is starting to be created. And to me, long term, what that really looks like is, again, back to what I write in the book about the emergence of intelligent health systems. Eventually, those who get this figured out and get it figured out first using the technology in the cloud are really going to be the purveyors of what I would call care anywhere. So if you're a consumer and you have the choice of doing things that are more convenient for you, equally effective, you're going to choose that over someone doing the traditional thing of looking you in the eye and saying, I'm going to put you in the hospital, I'm going to put you between the sheets, when in fact there are certain types of cases where going forward that doesn't need to happen. Finally, just even taking that one step farther, back to things like life science that you were mentioning early and the markets you serve, I'm very impressed with things like, so if you look at work being done by people like Dr. Eric Topol and the Scripps Research Institute, which to me, they're leading the way in digital clinical trials. So you look at the traditional way clinical trials work, and you've got humans and you've got all these things that you have to bring together and monitor and manage. And then you look at the work they're doing in digital clinical trials to make that much more agile, to frankly make it much more inclusive when it comes to trying to develop that population that you're running through the trial and having them balance on all those things that a good study needs to involve. And so I look at those things, much of which is driven by technology and intelligence. So in the hands of smart people who know those processes now, those are the people who are going to be driving that change going forward.
So on that note, I mean, a big fan of Eric Topol's books as well. The question comes down to is, what does the future of clinical trials look like? You've spoken a lot and written a lot around the intelligent health consumer, and they're very much part of the central hub of all that is and going to be in healthcare. But discovery, innovation is a core component of the way that we're going to continue to build software as medical devices, new chemical, identities, biologics, et cetera. So we have these clinical trials. A lot of them have been done in person, and we're now starting to move the needle on real world evidence and decentralization and hybrid trials. But you've also alluded to this idea of trials in silica. What is the clinical trials of the future going to look like, and how is Microsoft going to be involved in that?
Well, they're certainly better experts on clinical trials than I am. But again, I'd start by pointing to the great work at places like Scripps Research Institute. And so as they, formulate these new approaches, they pilot it, then the adjacency is as they're doing that, all of the other academic medical centers, researchers who can then pile onto that. We're seeing other things when it comes to essentially use of algorithms. So if someone's creating something that allows you to kind of do things as well as simple as complex as if you're launching 10 clinical trials, can use predictive capabilities to instead of waiting for the trial period to be 80% over to start looking at effectiveness, you can start with a sample size, really predicting how 10 different trials will go, which ones need to be adjusted, which ones maybe you come to a certain conclusion before you run the full gamut of that trial. Beyond that, and it's probably another adjacency. I was talking to someone who's a chief data scientist with a major pharma and life science company, and the conversation basically went along the lines of, going forward, how does pharma and life science go beyond what we would call monetizing molecules, where there are the drugs, and then you look at what are all the adjacent things when it comes to smart technology, wearables, IoT or edge technologies that really enhance, amplify, leverage, whether it's drug compliance, whether it's demonstrating drug effectiveness, or whether it's, in the realm of diabetes of you've got the pharma side, but then you've got the monitoring side, you've got the management side when it comes to lifestyle. And bringing all that together is probably more of that continuum that's going to drive value than simply that let's monetize molecules going forward.
I really love that. And I don't want this to become like a blockchain discussion, but it really does beg the question as we start to hear a lot around tokenization, Ethereum, and again, all sorts of work around Chainlink, Oracle networks, and those sorts of things. Is
You
it
got all the
does make
buzzwords in.
I'm sorry, I just love this kind of thing. So it really does beg the question about what does the future healthcare company look like? Is it built on specific drugs? So as we look at tokenizing, we may not no longer need to buy a stock for an entire company, but you can actually have, people purchasing based on specific molecules, or like you said, all of these other extensions to that. And these contributors can be financial or people who work. So the concept of a company can vary from place to place and who's involved, who's contributing, and it could be on a drug by drug basis. I was curious what your thoughts about this new tokenized world that we might be living in the future.
Yeah. Well, again, anyone can kind of try and look down the road and give an opinion. I'll give mine. I mean, starting off with, the whole area of precision medicine is a very popular topic. It's a bit of a shiny object in some regards, but when you look at where we are, we're very much in the infancy. When you look at where I think we'll be going in the next decade, much of that is driven by artificial intelligence. I think we will get to the point where we have the ability to do quick mapping, where personalized medicine really does get down to the individual, and the ability to almost have designer drugs that's specific to you, and not you as whatever. There's a class of women who are 45, they've got certain makeups, maybe they've already been diagnosed with a very specific breast malignancy. That'll get helped, but I believe we'll reach a point where there'll be things like testing that then allow you to, if there's a problem, if there's an issue, to truly have the approach, including the pharma side of your treatment, be totally personalized to you as an individual. Another quick example that I'm reminded of is Microsoft is working with a really great company called Adaptive Biotechnologies out of Seattle. We've heard about mapping, genomics for the last couple of decades. They're working to basically map the human immune system. And the work they're doing is just crazy smart, but the ability, imagine to at some point in the future, having a single blood test that taps into being able to map everything about your immune system, to both make predictions on your likelihood of certain things, as well as being able to handcraft solutions that absolutely are optimized to your immune system versus your partners or your kids. And I think that's where we're going. We see early innovative companies really pushing the boundaries, and say we're all early in the journey, but those are the kind of things that I think are going to come into play in the next decade.
It's going to be very interesting around workflow. And I know that you had alluded to that word, and it was very much part of your book as well, too, around how we're going to operationalize this, because this is a huge component. Because at the end of the day, brains are lazy. People like to get into automaticity. They like to do what they already know. And suddenly you throw some extra zinger in there, and it's like, how on earth am I going to integrate this? So interoperability is essential. But more importantly, bigger questions, existential questions. What is going to happen to radiologists? What is going to happen to ophthalmologists? We have seen recently, as an example, that Google has released that Derm Assist, where you basically take some pictures of your skin condition, and they're very much doing that sort of triage. So what is going to happen to the role of physicians or healthcare providers? Are they going to become just very fancy data scientists?
Well, I think anyone who is ever on the sharp end of the stick of being a doctor, being a nurse, or even being a patient knows that the human element is hugely important. So, to answer your question, and it's funny because radiologists always seem to take the heat first on this conversation, but so I was getting ready to do a workshop. This was pre-COVID at the largest academic children's facility in Canada, and it was the CEO and all the medical directors, and I was getting ready to get introduced. And, as always, there was a table of all the medical directors who had already grabbed coffee and were just sitting around yucking it up before they introduced me. And I was sitting there as one of the medical directors turned to the head of radiology and said, have you gotten your Uber license yet? And, they were razzing the head of radiology, say, this guy's talking about AI. You're going to probably be driving an Uber after a period of time. And to me, for example, radiology is a great area. They're actually, as a specialty, innovating faster, farther than probably any other specialty. So to answer your question, there are certain things that AI does really well, better than humans. So pattern recognition, going through massive amounts of data to find trends. But when you think about what humans are good at, and particularly part of the care process, it's reasoning, it's judgment, it's wisdom, it's creative problem solving. All of those things are the unique capabilities of humans. No AI can do that now, and my belief is no AI will be capable of that for decades to come. So it really is how we bring those things together, the best of AI getting in and behind the best of the human capabilities. So in the case of radiologists or anyone dealing with imaging, that could be pathologists, that could be many others, my ability to basically do pattern recognition, build that into essentially creating intelligent images, which allows me then to have intelligence do pre-reads. So if there are 100 images to go through, and AI can, surface those that need to be read first because there's a potential abnormality, it allows radiologists to be more effective. It allows them to have better control of their time. And then if you really look at what radiologists do, people just stereotype they're, stuck in these little dark rooms reading images. They are probably one of the best, most important consultants to every other specialist when it comes to what that specialist is doing. So imagine they've got more time to be doing the consults, more time to actually spend with patients, more time to perhaps actually get home for dinner, which they often don't do. So it's that combination of how do we bring in the best of AI and put it behind not just doctors, but anyone who's a knowledge worker. So that knowledge worker can be a doctor, a nurse, it can be the head of rev cycle, it can be the person that's trying to figure out how to reduce denials, or any of a number of roles in pharma and life science.
We're on the precipice of like a data, a world of data. Data, as we've heard this over and over as a cliche, is the new gold. And so we've got these new data lakes and we're able to tap in, and there's just data everywhere. People are wearing 24-hour glucose monitors and smartwatches and this app and that app, and stuff is getting churned in and electronically transmitted into the electronic health record. So there's no shortage of this data. So the question comes down to is, how do we conduct knowledge management? It's one thing about getting zeros and ones and a whole slew of stuff, but who is curating this? How do we make it make sense to people? And what are these dashboards looking like? And I'm curious about what Microsoft is looking at doing to make these data lakes come alive.
Yeah. That is probably one of the most pivotal questions for anyone in healthcare, particularly if you're a leader and you have interest in saying, I want to use AI, but more importantly, I want to use AI at scale across an enterprise or across a division. So I'd back up and start with, to put a finer point on what you just said. So there's one study that shows if you were a newly minted physician in 1950, you'd go your entire practicing career, 50 years, before medical knowledge doubled. That same study estimates that today medical knowledge is doubling every 73 days. So think about that. You can be the best trained physician coming out of residency going into practice today, knowing that a couple months from now, there'll be twice the amount of knowledge that you either have to deal with or you use as an opportunity to be better at whatever your specialty is. So that is many times as an advisor to big healthcare organizations, leaders are kind of wringing their hands saying it's a problem. And I turn that around to say, what an incredible opportunity. I often, in dealing with health leaders, they'll come back from a conference, they'll have read an article, and I'll hear them say, well, data's the new currency in healthcare. And whenever I hear that, I chuckle, because my next question to whoever said that is, if data's the new currency for healthcare, are you managing your data the same way you manage your finances? And usually there's a pause and then there's a chuckle, and then we can have the conversation about how, data is the key to driving transformation. It's the key to innovation. And yet today, whether you're a provider organization, a life science company, most organizations are not equipped to, you mentioned data lake. I take that a step farther to say, fundamentally, transformation and agile transformation at scale is all about creating and managing a modern data state. Now that includes things like data lakes. It includes other things where it allows for the provisioning and use of all types of data, not just the data we think of. If you're a provider, it's my EMR data, it's my imaging data, all data, inside, outside. There's a great new report that just came out this week from Frost and Sullivan on the value of social determinants of health information. And the factoid that I was struck with is where they say non-medical factors impact 80% of all health outcomes. So think about that for a moment. If 80% of healthcare outcomes are impacted by non-medical things, such as social determinants of health, your economics, where you live, other things, and most organizations, when they're talking about their data estate, are talking about the data that's kind of within their garden walls. What are the opportunities for those who not only get their house in order with a modern data estate to make better, more agile use of their data, but that data estate allows you to ingest any type of data that might be valuable in figuring out, again, I'm a pharma company. If I can do something with my drugs and marry that with some lifestyle factor, and get a multiple of beneficial outcomes that I can demonstrate, what's the value of that? Or the value to a provider of looking at managing health, including many of those things as simple as food deserts, that if I can get a handle on that, I produce better health outcomes, and chances are I'm doing that at a lower price point per consumer.
It's absolutely brilliant and so incredibly essential. And so really, what Microsoft and companies like yourself are really ultimately trying to do is bring this data into a place where there can be huge things done through population health management, predictive analytics, getting from a sickness care system to a wellness care system. And I'm just kind of curious also as well around Microsoft's vision to tie people together, to increase the collaboration. the coordination of healthcare teams in a way that we've never done so before. So there's an inclusion of all ideas, all thought processes, and making this a lot more seamless. What is Microsoft doing on that level to ensure that we're delivering care in a way that that's a lot more seamless?
Yeah, well, I mean, there we're doing a host of things. So starting really within the systems and how care teams work. So again, I'd come back to COVID, where COVID produced a lot of good benefit as far as change. So I, as a data and AI guy, I'm always talking about predictive analytics and everything else. So let's say we've done something really unusual with predictive capabilities. I have the ability to do something. I'm a physician specialist, and I have the ability to make predictions about either diagnoses or which treatment is going to produce the best outcomes. That's all great, but everyone always talks about actionable insights in healthcare. Insights are only actionable if shared and collaborated with that full team working with a patient or population of patients. So things like, COVID brought to the forefront a lot of the collaboration tools Microsoft has, like Microsoft Teams. We've got health and medical grade versions of that. You start looking at, jumping from improving collaboration capabilities and the efficiency within care teams to then including the patients and the consumers. And we've got a lot of things like dynamic CRM that really allows you to start personalizing, communicating, connecting with the consumer. And we talk a lot about improving collaboration among care teams, and to me, that is great, and we're making great progress. But again, looking ahead, there's a certain percentage of the patient consumer population that they too want to be part of that collaboration. And our ability to bring all that together, not only to make it more efficient, but allow a physician, a consumer, to be able to say, here are my preferences for how I want to be involved in managing my health. And then when there's something wrong, so there's managing health, which is truly, how do I maintain my health? And then when there's something that's not right, how do I engage not just the care team, but I involve the individual consumer, and I do that on their terms, not just a generic, hey, here's the way we do it. And so we've got a lot of tools. We're seeing a lot of interest and uptake based on what happened in the last year with COVID.
Microsoft has done a brilliant job over the many, many years that it has been around in creating very elegant, simple solutions that can be applied across the board in all sorts of scenarios. So the tools are ubiquitous, but the use cases are, infinite. Healthcare is like a completely different animal. You look at one state against another, one country against another. It's literally a kaleidoscope and a mashup of all kinds of things happening. And so the ultimate question comes down to is there an elegant solution? Is there a patient journey that one can standardize so that the experience is consistent but at the same time unique? But what is that kind of magic formula that people are looking at? I'm thinking about specifically institutions saying, yeah, AI, mumble jumble, all that's great, but how do I use this tool? Same thing with pharma. I want to know how, all this data that's coming in, how do I determine how I can predict how a physician is going to utilize my drug? What is the roadway or the map that Microsoft is creating in order to create the brilliant sort of easy solutions that you have that you're so for your claim to fame for?
Well, again, it's a simple yet complex question. So when I look at the vision, when I look at least the trajectory that we're seeing, the goal is to move towards what you just described, where when we talk about, personalized health, we're not talking about some broad brushstroke that, every woman that fits this category gets treated the same way. And whether that's the clinical diagnosis and treatment process, or whether that's just how in the course of your interactions, just in life, healthcare offers things that are personalized to the way you live, the things you care about. So that's happening. There's already technology I point to or talk about from Microsoft and others that empowers that. The real issue comes back to me again. It's that what I call the leadership imperative of, you know, healthcare has run, particularly in America, a certain way. So if you're a provider org, and much of that, unfortunately, is driven by the incentives created by, how you're paid, how you make money. But if we look at the capabilities of technology to push us much closer to that individual experience, the technology exists. It is all about understanding, mapping, and changing everything from those clinical workflows to the consumer journey. And I had the opportunity to do a keynote with someone else a couple of months ago, and it was all around the patient experience. And we titled the talk, to your point, how to have a delightful patient experience. Because most of the time, if you talk to a patient about their patient experience, it's rare that the word delighted would get used. So there was one study last year from Change Healthcare and Harris Polling Organization where they surveyed health consumers. There was a large percentage of health consumers who said, when I have something that I need to approach the health system on, finding, accessing, and paying for healthcare is such a hassle. Half of those who need service just don't do it because it's such a hassle. So imagine our ability to move from that to something that is a great experience, similar to whatever it is you do online with something else, whether it's a retail experience, whether it's a banking experience. I mean, other industry have done much better knowing how to delight the consumer. And just as those other industry have done it, we're capable of that. The technology's there. It's about how do we rethink that patient journey and the experience we want to give them.
How do we do that as well too in a world of such disparity? We have the haves and the have-nots. We have the underserved and underprivileged. We have people who have 5G and other people who don't even have a reliable internet connection. Telehealth is involved in this, access to all sorts of other apps and tools and methodologies. In that comes the question of biased algorithms. Are we treating people the way they need to? Are these people involved and included? There's inclusion, diversity, and a whole slew of other questions around access, payments, reimbursement, affordability. How can Microsoft and the teams around you help to start to solve or think through some of these really big, complex questions?
Well, first of all, I'm so glad you brought that up. It is such a huge and important and sometimes underrepresented issue. I mean, everyone gets very caught up in digital transformation of healthcare. The tools are there. Many things are happening that actually produce overall good. But to your point, if I can produce something that's measurably producing overall good, but there's variance in who it's producing good for, is that okay? It can be technically, correct. It can be regulatorily and legally correct, and still be unethical. So at Microsoft, I'm very proud of the fact we have led the way for years in what we call responsible AI. So everything we do in developing products, we put it through a rigorous set of AI principles and responsible AI principles. To your point on things like bias, we're seeing, and there's a really great expose article in the New England Journal of Medicine from last year that shows, some of the biases we see in the real world are starting to cross over in the digital world of healthcare through algorithms. So, we're early in the journey. We have the ability to stop or mitigate those things. So it's things like, when it comes to bias in algorithms, I don't believe that there's purposeful conscious bias, but I think there's a lot of unconscious bias. Bias comes into algorithms through things like the data. So in America, healthcare, despite your opinion, is legally not a right. So what that means is those who are well insured, their data is more representative in the data used to create algorithms than someone who is uninsured, which often then brings in issues of people of color, vulnerable populations. So there are tools, there are protocols to look at how we address those things, but it starts with, first of all, creating awareness and then creating commitment to say, when we're doing good, we should look at doing good for all, not just for some. Beyond that, and I'll bring it back to your earlier question. So last year, COVID really produced great visibility and proved that telemedicine works. But increasingly, there's some data coming forward of what happened in the last year to say it produced great value, but then you start looking at it, it's uneven. It produces great value if you're middle class and above. If you're in a rural area and you don't have connectivity, if you're an older American and your digital literacy skills are low or non-existent, those are the things that create impediments where it benefits some, but not all. Almost all of this is solvable. It starts with awareness and then commitment to say, we're going to focus on making sure these things benefit everyone, not just some.
Huge. Absolutely love the fact that you're thinking about these things. Super, super important. I think the other issue that is incredibly important and in the hearts and minds of everybody, especially in light of the SolarWinds issue, what's happened recently with Microsoft as well, but so many other company, that recently what happened with the Colonial pipeline as well, is security. Then comes up the question of privacy and my health data. What should be shared versus not? What do I own? What can I make money on? How are people absorbing, my biometrics seamlessly, and ambiently? How are people using software, facial recognition, and the list goes on. These are big, chunky bioethical, privacy, regulatory, and legislation issues. Are we working in legacy structures that are not going to be able to solve this? Where are we going to be able to help define some of the answers to these issues?
Well, once again, your question is very broad. We could spend an hour just teasing out some things. Generally what I'd say is everyone's in evolution mode. And, there's a lot of technology, including at Microsoft, where, we develop it and the focus is doing good in the world. And there are others who can take that and use it for nefarious purposes, use it for illegal purposes. And, that's going to always exist. It's more about how we evolve the technology, first of all, to be as bulletproof as we can make it when it comes to the technical side of security and compliance. Beyond that, the question of, that classic case of who owns the data and how should it be used? And, at the end of the day, I believe, and Microsoft believes, that data on you is your data. You should own it. You should control it. You should be the one that sets the parameters for how it's used. And that's where I believe, if it's a group of consumers, let's say you're a diabetic, and you have the ability to volunteer or opt into something where your data, either retrospective or as it's coming through that monitoring device, you give permission for that to get put into a pool and used to try and define things that will produce a greater good for the population of diabetics, as well as eventually maybe you or your children. But those are things we have the ability to do technically, legally. A lot of that's coming forward, particularly as you look at some of the laws and regulations in the EU with GDPR. But I mean, those are the things that are infinitely manageable. And I believe most consumers, if faced with either a challenge themselves or an issue they have passion over, and they can see common good by volunteering, opting in for their data to be used, I believe most reasonable consumers will do that.
Yeah.
And those that don't want to, that's absolutely their right. And that's where it should absolutely be protected and their wishes respected.
Beautiful, beautifully said. We're living in the time of immense discovery, innovation, and it's literally a renaissance of sorts, and many exciting things, which also can become or be viewed very dystopically. So, one of the questions has to do with, the curiosity around surveillance.
Mhm.
And the big brother, like the Microsofts and the Googles and the big five, the FANG group, getting into things like brain machine interfaces. We think about Elon Musk's Neuralink, and we're talking about AR and VR, and are we living in a simulation, and all and the questions go on and the conspiracy theories go on. How do companies like Microsoft stay real, stay agile, stay out of the theories that, somebody is trying to get into their brain and mind read and take over the world? Like, how does Microsoft sort of stay nimble?
Yeah, well, let me see if I can parse that one out. So first of all, I would say anyone who's interested, look closely at Microsoft's not only view, but approach to how we manage data, and compare us to any other big information technology company. I think you'd find we are a leader, if not the leader, in being mindful and respectful of everything you just said relative to individual rights or the rights of populations of people. Number two, if you look closely at things like, again, back to, there's so many things AI is really good at, such as pattern recognition. So you look at that applied to facial recognition. Facial recognition can be really an outstanding good cause. There was a company that just was reporting out on how they're using facial recognition in infants to look for things like genomic maladies or things caused by genetic things. So the ability to use that to try and do an early diagnosis of a child and a potential life-threatening illness is hugely important. You then look at how it's applied broadly to things like facial recognition with populations in public. And again, I would say for any of those issues, look closely at Microsoft's position, not only stated, but how we act. And I'm very proud of the fact that we're very mindful and responsible when it comes to our role, our position in how those things happen or don't happen. Beyond that, again, I look at all the things that organizations are doing with our technology and data that they have a right to do good. We have a full program, just to do a call out. We have a whole program where we give millions of dollars away every year called AI for Good. So if you just go out and type in any search engine, AI for Good in Microsoft, you'll see all the great things we are doing to encourage this application, not for nefarious things, but for good things in health, in education, in the environment. And the key here is, anyone that's pushing on any issues in that area, any of those areas, can go out, submit an application, and potentially get a grant from Microsoft to help further what you're doing using things like AI in the cloud. So I'm very proud of where we are. There are clearly issues there, and we're constantly looking at what those issues are, how they're coming forward when it comes to some of the things you were mentioning that have been in the news, and then what we do to address them.
What are some of the high-level partnerships you have created with Microsoft and some life science companies?
Well, there are a number that I can't talk about because of NDAs, but we've done a lot of work with groups like Novartis. We've done a lot on things like COVID registries. We've done a number of things through partners on clinical trials. But again, when you look at things like things as simple as the infusion of intelligence or any process in the pharma and life science area where if we were to go through a planning process for someone running a process and the ability to say, if there are three things you could predict to make something you're working on better, what would they be? And if you can define those things, then chances are Microsoft is working with pharma companies to get in behind those things that those experts, those specialists define as needed.
Absolutely love it. And I just want to say, I'm sure a lot of people listening to this have really enjoyed watching the transformation of Microsoft over the past 5 to 10 years and the brilliant work that's happening in healthcare. It's very exciting, and we're all kind of rooting for that. So for anybody who's listening who really enjoyed this conversation, I encourage you to check out the show notes after. We will have the contact details for Tom, Lawry. If you're interested in partnerships, inquiring further about some of the really interesting the work that they're doing in the life sciences, in the healthcare space, I invite you to please get in contact. Also, we invite you to take a look at impetusdigital.com. These are the kinds of conversations that we have in our platform with various stakeholders, payers, patients, allied healthcare providers, physicians, other people, to actually have a series of ongoing asynchronous and synchronous virtual communication sessions, moving agendas, policies, procedures, documents, ideas forward. And this is actually how work and progress happens. So please check out impetusdigital.com. We would love if you can like and subscribe to our channel, and would really appreciate if you can leave a review on our podcast. Thank you, everybody, for your time today. I really appreciate this fabulous discussion, Tom, and the wonderful work that is happening at Microsoft, and wishing you a wonderful day ahead.